welcome to the first chapter of the story, The Midnight Shift. The rain lashed against Dr. Adrian Wells' window, mimicking the turmoil in his mind. For years, he'd devoted his life to one pursuit, to controlling time itself. Some dismissed his work as madness, but Adrian knew he was on the cusp of a breakthrough. Tonight was the culmination of his obsession, the answer to his midnight prayers. The doorbell chimed, startling him out of his concentration. Adrian frowned, wondering who could be visiting him in this weather. On impulse, he pulled up the security cameras on his phone. The image on the screen was distorted by the rain, but he could just about make out a slim package being left on his doorstep. Whoever it was must have knocked several times, because the doorbell camera had captured a series of insistent rings. He couldn't remember ordering anything, but curiosity got the better of him. He decided to check it out. Stepping out into the storm, he picked up the package. There was no address, no return address, nothing but a dark, greasy stain where the label should have been. As he brought the package closer, he noticed an inscription on the bottom. It read, "To Adrian, for when you need the truth." His heart skipped a beat. This wasn't for him. This was meant for someone else. Driven by morbid curiosity, Adrian brought the package inside and laid it on his table. The rain was coming down in buckets. Now, thunder rattled the windows and lightning illuminated his tense face as he stared at the package. Hesitantly, he reached out and sliced open the brown tape holding it together. The package was surprisingly heavy. He lifted the lid and found a layer of packing peanuts, and nestled in the middle was a small velvet pouch. As he untied the drawstring, Adrian's eyes widened in surprise. Inside was an old pocket watch, its surface tarnished and covered in intricate ink. He delicately lifted it out and examined the design. The hands on the watch seemed frozen in place. He turned the watch over and his breath caught in his throat. The back cover was inscribed with a single sentence, "Set me to midnight, and you will see the truth." Signed below it was a name that sent a shiver down his spine. His name. But how could this be? He'd never seen this watch before. He wound the key gently and set the watch to the current time. The ticking started soft but soon became louder, filling the room with an ominous sound. Was this some kind of joke? A cruel prank played by his colleagues? But who would do such a thing and why? Adrian tried to shake off the unease growing in his chest. He told himself it was just an old watch, nothing more. Yet he couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The wind outside suddenly picked up, rattling the windows. The storm was intensifying. Despite his better judgment, Adrian found himself drawn to the watch. He wound it again, this time setting it to midnight. As the hands clicked into place, a jolt ran through him. He shook it off, assuming it was just his imagination. But then, the room started to shake. At first it was subtle, like the hum of a distant engine, but it grew louder, more intense, until the entire room was vibrating. He watched in disbelief as the once familiar objects in his living room became distorted, stretched, then vanished. Before he could react, he was engulfed by a blinding white light, and then everything went black. Chapter 2: A City Frozen in Time. When Adrian regained his senses, the first thing he noticed was the silence. It was as if the world had collectively held its breath. He looked around and realized with a jolt that he wasn't in his home anymore. He was on the same street, outside his house, but everything was different. It was like the city had been cast in stone. Cars hovered in midair, suspended as if time had stopped while they were moving. Pedestrians were frozen in place, their gestures and expressions locked in an eternal moment. A woman raising her hand as if to hail a cab, a child reaching out to a dog, a couple sharing an umbrella, all of them trapped in time's embrace. Even the rain seemed to have halted in midair, turning the sky into a shattered mirror reflecting the distorted city. Adrian stumbled back, overwhelmed by what he was seeing. What had happened to the city? More importantly, what had happened to the people? He quickly realized that he wasn't alone. A closer inspection revealed dozens of frozen figures scattered throughout the streets, all silently observing the spectacle. Were they residents of this city? Had they all been affected by the watch? He continued walking, hoping to find someone who could explain what was happening. But the more he saw, the deeper his confusion grew. People were frozen in unnatural positions, their faces frozen in expressions of surprise or fear. A man had been caught mid-stride, his briefcase still clutched in his hand. A dog was suspended mid-bark, its tail frozen in a playful wag. Even the insects and birds seemed to have been locked in time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. It displayed an eerie message. No signal. No time. Just a mocking 0 hours, 0 minutes and 0 seconds. Midnight. Adrian looked around at the frozen city. Midnight. Why did the watch have to be set to midnight? What was so significant about this time? Before he could dwell on the question, a voice echoed from behind him. You shouldn't be here. He spun around and saw a tall man standing at the end of the street. The man was cloaked in a long black coat that concealed his features. His face was partially hidden in the shadows, but Adrian could sense the intensity of his gaze upon him. Who are you? Adrian demanded, trying to project confidence, but his voice trembled slightly. The man took a step forward and the world glitched around him. The frozen figures shimmered and the buildings seemed to warp and twist. Who are you? Adrian repeated, taking a step back. The man's lips curled into a faint smile. The real question is, he said, his voice low and resonant, who will you become? With a snap of his fingers, the frozen world shifted. The people stirred, the cars descended from the sky, and the rain resumed its steady rhythm. The world lurched back into motion, but Adrian wasn't in his city anymore. He found himself amidst the ruins of a wasteland. Crumbling buildings scraped the fractured sky. Twisted metal skeletons protruded from the rubble and strange. Massive gears turned slowly overhead, grinding against the very fabric of time. As he walked through the desolate landscape, he saw it. A row of bodies, lying in a clearing. They were all Adrian, or at least they would become Adrian. Some were old, withered husks, others young, barely recognizable, but all bore the same striking resemblance to him. Panic clawed at his throat. What was this place? Why was he seeing these figures? And why did they all look exactly like him? The shadowless man stepped out from behind a broken wall. Your past attempts, he said quietly, as if sharing a secret. Every time you tried to fix time, it took a piece of you. Adrian staggered back, horrified. Was this why he'd received the watch? Was this a warning from a past version of himself? The shadowless man nodded slowly. I thought you deserved to know the truth, he said softly. All the lives you've touched, the ripples in time you've caused. It's a heavy burden to bear. Adrian felt tears stinging his eyes. The weight of his obsession, the sacrifices he'd made, the lives he'd disrupted, it all crashed down on him in that moment. But how do I stop this? He asked, his voice breaking. How do I undo what I've done? The man sighed and shook his head. The answer is in your hands, he said, gesturing to the pocket watch clutched tightly in Adrian's grip. Adrian stared at the watch. The inscription on the back burned into his memory. Smash me before midnight. He looked up at the frozen sky, the cracked buildings, the ceaseless gears, knowing that every second that ticked by was another life lost, another version of himself erased. In his hands, the pocket watch. In the sky, the fractured clock. In his hands, the power to shatter time. In the sky, the countdown to oblivion. Adrian's gaze was fixed on the watch. The decision was his. Would he defy time, or would he let it slip away? Final chapter. The decision. The thunder boomed, echoing Adrian's pounding heart. The watch felt heavy in his hand, each tick a hammer blow on his resolve. Outside, the gears in the sky ground relentlessly, their metallic groans a dirge for the dying time. The road ahead was clear, leading straight to the clock tower whose hands were frozen in a silent scream. He glanced back at the city of perpetual midnight, at the faces trapped in eternal stillness, and finally at the watch in his hands. Its ticking seemed to grow louder, drowning out the cries of the dying world. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he made his choice. With a choked sob, he smashed the watch against the pavement. At first, nothing happened. The gears in the sky kept turning, the clock's hands remained frozen, and the city stayed stuck in midnight. Then slowly, ever so slowly, the world began to shift. The gears slowed, the hands moved, and the people stirred, blinking in the sudden sunlight. The city came back to life, breathing, moving, vibrant. Adrian sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face. It was working, he'd fixed it. But as the last of the midnight drained away, he knew his journey was far from over. The damage done to the space-time continuum would take years, perhaps lifetimes to repair. As the sun rose over the horizon, casting its warm glow over the bustling city, Adrian stood up, wiping the tears and the grime from his face. He knew he couldn't stay here. He had to keep moving, keep searching for a way to restore balance to the universe. He had a responsibility, a burden, he now shared with countless versions of himself across the timeline. He looked up at the sky, a vast expanse, now free from the grinding gears, and took a deep breath. The world was set right, for now. He was needed elsewhere. As the first rays of dawn touched his skin, Adrian Wells, the time traveler, disappeared into the rising sun, leaving behind a world that had just woken up to a new day. Epilogue, The Vanishing Hour. In a quaint apartment filled with scientific instruments, a young scientist sat hunched over a table, examining an old pocket watch. He traced the inscription on the back with his finger. "Set me to midnight, and you will see the truth." It was a strange artifact he'd found tucked away in his late grandfather's belonging, and tonight was the night he planned to unravel its secrets. The storm outside raged, mirroring the turmoil in his mind. Setting the watch to midnight, he waited, captivated by the possibility that this ordinary antique held the key to extraordinary revelations. As the clock chimed midnight, the room flickered, and the scientist braced himself for whatever revelation the watch had in store for him. For the world of time travel and alternate realities doesn't cease to exist when one story ends. It merely waits for the next midnight to unveil its mysteries once more. The cycle continues. The question is, will you set the watch?